an employment bill had already been drafted, and we had seen its provisions prior to COVID. So the provisions that were, really interesting were to do with codifying or clarifying provisions of the Employment Act that had not been or were subject to ambiguity before. So, for example, how disciplinary hearings are taking place, so codifying that. Constructive dismissal, making sure that is also a disciplinary type procedure. Suspension of employees, allowing for that. Extending working hours, so we were seeing working hours extended from 8 hours to 12 hours. And also considering adoptive leave for parents who are adopting children, to give them the same rights or similar rights to parents who are going on maternity or paternity leave themselves. So all of those changes were making sure that the employers were or are aware of their obligations and making it very clear. And I think those were welcome. Other changes that were very important from a commercial perspective were to do with the transfer of employees in a merger type situation. Usually in a merger type situation, we usually say that employees must be made redundant prior to them going into the new employing entity as a result of a merger. The 2P type legislation that is coming in the employment bill makes sure that employees can be transferred when a merger occurs without having the extended financial burden of the redundancy. So that was all very good and well appreciated. What we now need to consider are amendments that will take into account the COVID type reality of employment. And that means working from home policies, whether or not people need to come into work to do their functions, what happens at work, returning to work after a pandemic or returning to work after an outbreak or something happens in the office, and really implementing flexible working provisions that still manage to protect employees, given the fact that COVID has changed the employment landscape significantly, and it is unlikely that we're going to go back to what we have seen previously. So the story of the employment landscape in 2020 is really a story of working from home. For all of those who have maintained their employment situation in 2020, the story is working from home, flexible ways of working, probably extended working hours, finding innovative ways to deliver, and being detached from the formal working environment that everyone has been used to, and everyone certainly who has been in the workforce for a long time has been used to. I think the reality for senior employees has been affected by attending conferences, trainings, traveling abroad for the delivery of their work. That is no longer happening. For expatriates, it means either repatriation or working from their homes. So the impact on work permits and entry into the country has been impacted. And for all employers and employees alike, it has meant redundancies, which is a process within itself, and then a rise in unemployment and employers having to find innovative ways of restructuring their employment workforce. So unpaid leave, voluntary early retirement, but the unemployment rate has been severely affected. We were at 5.2% last year. We're now at 10.4%. Unemployment as of July 2020 was at 200,000 more unemployed in Nairobi alone, by some statistics. And so it looks like unemployment is also another story of the COVID pandemic and the employment landscape. Looking forward, I think the reality is working from home or finding flexible ways of working and making sure that your employees are delivering exactly what you want for the type of work that you're doing. So not looking at a big workforce, but a more efficient and streamlined workforce is going to be the story of employment going forward. And that's the effect of the COVID pandemic on the employment landscape. So unpaid leave was a measure that employers sought to use early on in the COVID pandemic as a way of making sure that the financial burden or their employment financial obligations were reduced during the COVID pandemic. What the risks with an unpaid leave provision, firstly, is that you need to obtain an employee's consent, and you need a written consent because that is an amendment to their employment contract. So employees who have not sought the approval of the employees in writing run the risk that they may be taken to litigation for failure or unfair termination or constructive dismissal, which an employee can argue given the fact that they have not sought their consent. There's also an issue of the procedure that an employer has followed, and that can lead to litigation as well. In terms of the larger perspective in unpaid leave, employers need to consider whether that is a long-term strategy and what their long-term strategy will be. So while it would have been helpful to use an unpaid leave provision for a month or 2 months during the COVID pandemic, given the fact that we're now 9 months in, an unpaid leave provision is unlikely to work in the long term, simply because everyone has financial obligations that they need to meet. So employers need to think long term about the impact on their workforce in 2021. Think about whether unpaid leave should lead to a redundancy or termination or a restructuring of their entire employment landscape. And then think about the impact on losing good employees. There are other ways of structuring the employment arrangements that employers want to have now, including flexible working provisions, part-time working, a reduction in working hours, which may work better for an employer rather than simply looking to use an unpaid leave provision, given the timing now.